Hi, my name is Misty Anderson, and I am very excited that I'll have the chance to be with you next week in Maggie Dawn's seminar. What I wanted to do in this presentation is talk you through the selections that I've put together for you. I do apologize that they're all excerpts, but these are substantial texts. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where these chunks come from, and I suggest that you read the material in this order, and we'll try to use that as a rubric for our discussion next week. The first excerpt that I'm giving you is from Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self. And Taylor, who is a contemporary philosopher with a strongly theological bent, wants to historicize what he calls that notion of the inward self, which we think of as the intuitive way to think about being a self. Taylor argues that that self is a relatively modern invention. So he does a sweeping philosophical overview of ideas about how we think about consciousness, how we think about the external world and the internal. In that survey, he sees Augustine as a really important turning point toward this inwardness, but he points out that in Augustine, the external world is still full of evidence of God's order. With Descartes, he sees the big inward turn where moral sources are now inside of us. And the primary section that I'm having you read, has to do with John Locke, the late 17th century English philosopher. Locke is very important to understanding the development of the 18th century novel and largely 18th century political culture in England, and by extension on the continent. So for Locke, the Lockean self, says Taylor, involves a kind of radical reflexivity where you can imagine that your experience could have been someone else's experience. I'm going to focus on three ideas out of this excerpt: the notion of the punctual self, the procedural notion of rationality in Locke, and Locke's notion of instrumental control. So those are things to highlight in your reading, and we will cover all three of those in class. And finally, I'm going to propose that the notion of the self that Taylor defines in Locke is actually a very theatrical kind of self. It's a self with a theatrical relation to itself, to riff on Kierkegaard just a little bit. And we can talk about what that means in terms of theories of performance. The next excerpt is from Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And what I've done is I picked up the opening of the poem that the author writes to the reader as a kind of preface. Then the opening 15 pages or so of the novel itself. Do note that it has that marginalia in the first edition, which compares to the Geneva Bible, something we can talk about in class. And then I've got one page of the conclusion of the novel and the short epilogue poem that the author writes. Some of you may be familiar with Pilgrim's Progress, the story of Christian's allegorical journey through a dangerous landscape to the heavenly city. It's framed with a dream. The author falls into a dream and writes this story. You might think about what that does to the story, particularly with the information that Bunyan was a dissenting preacher. He was an Anabaptist who was actually jailed part of the time that he was writing Pilgrim's Progress for violating laws known as the Conventual Act that restricted who could preach where. You might also think about the kind of interiority that this novel generates. It's still in this world of allegory, so it's a little odd to us perhaps, but it is a way to think about being in the world, an inhabited world that is also still a spiritual landscape, and what is a kind of Reformation Lutheran thought about moving from the monastery to the world. And finally, think about how the figures in Pilgrim's Progress specularize or make visible spiritual terrors, spiritual concerns. And we'll talk a little bit about the influence of Fox's Book of Martyrs through the 17th and 18th centuries, where it remained very popular. Images, of course, of mainly Protestant martyrs to evil Catholic persecution. All right. The next excerpt that I have is from Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Again, this may be a familiar text to a lot of you, even if you haven't read it, though you know the story, that Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked on an island where he finds Friday. Well, the parts that I'm giving you to read include the opening section in which the author reflects on his advice from his father, how he didn't listen to it, and how his adventures began because he was resisting his father's good advice. But resisting his father's good advice is also what launches him into the world. And actually, at the end of Robinson Crusoe comes out very well. So you have that little bit of his introduction in which we find out that Robinson Crusoe is actually sold into slavery after being a captive. The next part that I'm giving you is Robinson Crusoe's journal. So his journal is embedded within the novel, where Defoe has been using this trope of Crusoe telling his story, and then inside of that we get supposedly Robinson Crusoe's journal, the journal that he kept on the island. We get a lot of very strong reality effects, and this novel is often referred to as a real sort of turning point in the development of what Ian Watt calls the realist novel. We're going to talk a little bit more about the reality effect of the novel and the problem of truth, which is also a problem in Pilgrim's Progress. Do novels tell the truth? And we're going to keep our eye on that performance question here. But in Crusoe, we certainly have very strongly Protestant arguments for the way that God appears in the world. And so in that excerpt, I think you've got some really interesting things to chew on. This excerpt ends before Robinson Crusoe meets Friday and before we get to the end of the novel, but it gives you a little slice of what his life is like. Pay attention to the description, and I want to talk to you about the reality effect of Robinson Crusoe. All right, the next set of excerpts is the most complicated. This is from a novel called Clarissa, which is lovingly referred to as The Brick by graduate students in the 18th century. It is enormous. It's also a masterpiece of epistolary fiction. In it, a young woman named Clarissa is being forced into an advantageous marriage to an older, cruel, and completely unsuitable man named Mr. Solmes. She's being forced by her family because they're trying to consolidate the family fortunes. Clarissa, who is very intelligent and a wonderful writer, resists this. We get this whole story in epistolary form as a series of letters between various members of the family, Clarissa's friend Anna Howe, and Lovelace. Lovelace is the villain of this story. He is attempting to seduce Clarissa, and Clarissa, who's forced into more extreme situations by her family, who actually locks her up, threatens her if she doesn't marry this terrible man. She escapes with the help of Lovelace, who is pretending to be her friend. Lovelace entraps her in various situations, kind of in this weird cat and mouse game where he is exploring his power over her and she is resisting it. He moves her to a second set of lodgings where he has actually hired prostitutes to pretend to be gentle ladies who are waiting on her. And spoiler alert, he eventually rapes her. This is a novel in which famously very little action happens. There's a great deal of dialogue, but I can tell you that if you do have the time, it is an incredibly compelling read. It was held to be the ideal novel by both Rousseau and the Marquis de Sade. That's quite a spread there. And Richardson's own intentions were, as he said, to write a religious novel, though he found that more people were fascinated with and admired Lovelace, who is a very compelling kind of voice. He writes himself into a problem similar to the problem of Milton's, who was said to be of the devil's party but didn't know it, that those evil characters are interesting. And this is one of the problems of epistolary fiction. It kind of comes to crisis in Clarissa. Clarissa is a figure of extreme devotion and piety, and also intellectual energy. She is not a victim by nature, but she is put in that structural position. And in the end, she winds up living out a kind of martyr's life, a holy living and dying, um, that culminates in her final words. But God Almighty would not let me depend for comfort upon any but Himself. So we'll talk a little bit about the novel as a space that performs these kinds of identities for us and the extreme performativity of the epistolary novel. Again, a very strong reality effect, but this time, unlike Crusoe's physical world, it's the reality of consciousnesses, these people we feel we know. We're well on the way to Jane Austen by the time we are at Richardson, although Austen herself is still another 50 years plus on the horizon. The last excerpt is from my own book, Imagining Methodism. I'm going to speak little about this because you'll be speaking to me or you'll be listening to me when you're reading it. But three things I want to highlight about my argument, and this is from the introduction, is that Methodism becomes a kind of dumping ground for anxieties about the modern self. And some of those ideas of Charles Taylor's, you will see the influence of them in my own introduction. I argue that Methodism is performatively constructed, especially in some of its key activities, including field preaching and revival meetings and hymn singing. And we'll talk in class a little bit about the hymn as a place to trace Methodism's challenge to that delimited punctual self, an I that becomes kind of oppressive with their appeal to a we. So I hope that you enjoy these excerpts. I hope they make sense to you as excerpts. And I'm really excited about having a nice rangy discussion where we can pull together some of these ideas and walk you through some key 18th century texts, giving you a stronger sense of how the novel develops a notion of a very self-reflexive self. Looking forward to seeing you soon.